Evolution, what it is and the evidence for it. So, recall that there are different versions of genes, and we call those versions of genes alleles within a population. So any population of any species will have different versions of genes within that population. Refer to this as the gene pool. That's the total number of alleles. We have the different versions in there, all of them within a population we can refer to as the gene pool. And the greater variety of genes there are within that pool, the greater the genetic diversity of the population. Evolution is any change in the heritable traits, so those genes, of a population across generations. That's all evolution is, a change in the gene pool over time. So Charles Darwin, who is linked with the theory of evolution, born in England, he dropped out of medical school. He believed in natural theology, intentions of being a clergyman, but he decided to go on this particular voyage. The HMS Beagle was the name of the ship, and to go on sort of accompany the captain on this voyage that was sailing around and charting different places around the world. Essentially a around the world voyage from England and back again. And so while on this voyage, he was taking note of the flora and fauna of the different areas that he was going to. And in doing so, he started to put together some ideas in his head. And again, he didn't come up with the idea of evolution, but what he did was he put together a comprehensive listing of the evidence that would support the mechanism in which evolution can happen. So Darwin's observation and then his hypothesis based on these observations. So one of the places he went to was these Galapagos Islands, and again linked to Darwin, and he saw that there's many plants, birds, and insects, and some reptiles. There's no amphibians or mammals on these islands at all. So his hypothesis was that these organisms came from the mainland. These islands are off the coast, and he's believing that the organisms that are there got there from the mainland. Only the types of organisms he saw, so the birds and the plants and the insects and some reptiles, would have been able to survive the voyage to the island, which would either have been by air or by sea. And so this is why you wouldn't see any amphibians. They can't fly and they wouldn't do very well in salt water. And you wouldn't see any mammals making that voyage either. They wouldn't be able to survive the trip itself. So, Galapagos Islands also had many species that were close to the species that were on the mainland right next to the island. So the islands themselves are off the coast here, and the species that he saw there looked like the species that he saw on the nearby island. They were similar, but not the exact same. So his idea was that when these animals are isolated, so when the population, the animals makes their way to the island somehow, and they're isolated from the mainland populations, over time they change to become different from their ancestors on the mainland. So Darwin used his observations and he began to accumulate the evidence to build a theory of the evolution of species. Here is 3 of the main points of the evidence for evolution at the time, as well as some modern stuff to add in. So biogeography, as we mentioned, based on what species are located where, the observed geographic patterns of distributions of species, and this can be based on living species that Darwin was able to see at the time that were still alive, but also he was able to see some fossilized evidence of species and looking at where they were located as well. So he found these unusual species on the Galapagos Islands that resembled those on the nearest continental landmass. They were closely related, however, they were not the same. They were different species that derived from a common ancestor, but because they were isolated from the mainland population, they started to develop adaptations that helped them live in their local environment. So the finches, Darwin's finches as a perfect example, he saw that there were these different finches that were relatively closely related, but they were their own different species, and their differences allowed them to survive in their particular habitat. And so this is looking at, if I say we had a common ancestor, maybe you'd find a bird like that on the mainland, but in certain parts of the Galapagos Islands there was more fruit to be found. And so the birds that lived in that area had particular adaptations that allowed them to find and benefit from the local food that was available for them. If there were more insects around, then that area had more of these finches that had a particular beak that helped them to survive by eating insects. So finch species have different beak shapes adapted for eating specific foods, all derived from the same ancestor, but depending on where their local environment or what was available in their local environment, they would have adapted to survive in that particular environment. Another example, not one that Darwin saw, but off the coast of California, there are these foxes that are the island fox in the islands, and then there's the mainland gray fox, and they are, again, a very similar species, but the island fox, which are isolated on the islands, have changed and adapted to their particular location. So evolution of major animal groups correlated with known changes in the distribution of land masses on Earth. So understanding a nearby island and the mainland and how you'd have some species on there, relatively short-term distributions. With the larger scale geographic distribution, global geographic distribution, we can see this with plate tectonics. And so if we look a long time ago, we had this sort of supercontinent called Pangaea, millions of years ago, and then it changed over time. The continents spread apart because of continental drift. What's interesting is the distribution of species is also affected by that as well. So plate tectonics or continental drift helped to make sense of these distributions. So here's a picture of Pangaea together, and then over time we saw things like South America and Africa separating from each other. They were together for a while, and now we see that they are separated. Same thing with Australia was connected to the rest of the continent at one point, and then it eventually became separated and is now currently all by itself. And so this continental drift affects the distribution of species as well. Looking particularly at Australia, Australia has lots of these marsupials. And so if you look at these marsupial mammals, you see these in Australia. And the reason for that can be explained by when Australia separated from the rest of the continents on the Earth. So mammals arose about 80 million years after Australia already separated. So the common ancestor between marsupials and mammals would have been back before 80 million years ago. The animals that were living in Australia have then evolved in isolation from the rest of the mammals that evolved around the world. So the evolution of, say, the placenta-based mammals was something that happened after Australia separated. So you don't see native placenta-based mammals on Australia's continent because they would have evolved on the other continents after Australia has separated. Second one, so the distribution of species biogeography is the first one. The second one is looking at homologous and analogous structures. Similar structures in species that share a common ancestor are called homologous structures. Structures that really function in one way in an ancestral species become modified as they take on new functions. So let's look at some examples of this. This would suggest that if they're using a modified version of a structure, that they share a common lineage or a common evolutionary origin. So for example, you would assume if you were building giraffes, being as they have a long neck, and if you were building manatees, as you see, they really don't have a neck. If you're going to build one or the other, you'd probably build them differently. But a giraffe and a manatee both have, and you too, have, what's that, 6, 7, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. They both have 7 neck bones. And so it doesn't make any sense why a manatee with no neck and a giraffe with a huge neck would have the same number of neck bones in them, unless, of course, they came from a common ancestor. So if there was a common ancestor that had 7 neck bones that evolved into a giraffe and evolved into the manatee, that would make sense why a giraffe and a manatee both have 7 neck bones. So here we have 2 skeletons, and you look at them and they look remarkably similar. And so we have a chimpanzee on the right, and we have a human on the left. And again, their skeletons are incredibly similar. And that doesn't make a lot of sense unless they both evolved from a common ancestor that had a very similar skeleton to 2 of them. And they both have adapted slightly different skeletons, but not that different skeletons because of the different environments that they live in. Forelimbs invertebrates, if we look at these guys here, so here's some very different animals. We have a human, a cat, a whale, and a bat. So incredibly different environments in which they're living in, and different arms in terms of how they use them and what they use them for. But oddly enough, the number and the placement, the ordering of their bones is the same in all of their arms. And so if you look at this major bone here, the humerus in humans, a cat also has one. And weirdly enough, a whale has one as well, and so does a bat. And then after the humerus, the next 2 in the line down the arm, we have the other 2 bones in the arm in the human. We have 2 in a cat. We have even 2 in a whale. And a bat's wing also has 2 forearm bones as well. And then you can get into even the wrist bones and the finger bones as well. This is looking at a descent with modification. So the common ancestor for all 4 of these species would have had an arm with similar bone structure that was modified and over time to be the human arm, the cat arm, the whale arm, and even the very differently used bat arm. Homologous versus analogous structures. So looking at the human and the bat and the whale and the cat it was, or here we have the human, the bird, the porpoise, and the elephant, same idea. So they all have similar bone structures. They have all descended from a common ancestor, and this would explain why their bone structure is going to be the same in all of their arms. It wouldn't make sense if you were going to try to make a flipper or a wing or an arm to build it the same way unless you had to start from the same place. An analogous structure is different than a homologous structure. So an analogous structure is where the function is the same, but they did not come from a common ancestor. So for example, a bird has a wing and a fly has a wing, but they are not built in the same way. They end up being used the same, but they are not built in the same way. They don't share the same structural similarities. So a bird's wing and a bat's wing, they would be homologous. They do have the same bone structure to them. They would have evolved from the same appendage in a common ancestor. A fly, though, its common ancestor with a bird or a bat did not have any appendages, and so it evolved separately on its own. Embryonic development is not the strongest piece of evidence, but it does help out when you look at individuals, creatures as they're developing. And if you look at them earlier enough, what you can see is that the many different embryos end up looking similar at certain stages. So if you look at a fish, salamander, turtle, chicken, and human, at this particular early stage here in their development, they all look pretty similar. In the second stage shown, so later in their development, what we can start to see is that creatures that are more closely related start to differentiate and look different than creatures that are more differently related. So these two here, the fish and the salamander, we can conclude, okay, they look pretty similar further along in their development, whereas a turtle, a chicken, and a rabbit, they're going to be different than the salamander and fish. So we can look at their embryonic development over time, and we can sort of see those changes happening within the development of the individual. So as embryos develop, they become more and more distinct, but looking earlier in the development, you can sort of see those relationships earlier on. The more similar the stages are, the more closely related they are. So if we look at, let's say, a rabbit and a human, even at later stage development, they tend to be fairly similar. You can definitely tell the turtle and the chicken apart, but the rabbit and the human even later in stages of development are more similar, so we can conclude that they're more closely related. Modifications include the loss of structures. So we have these vestigial structures that are essentially remnants of past structures that aren't used by that organism in its particular environment anymore. And so typically they used to have an important function, but currently in that particular species, because of its environment, it doesn't have any great importance. And so if we look at snakes, pythons actually have hind limbs as part of their skeleton. You don't see it on them, but as part of their skeletons, they do have small bones there. And whales also have these sort of useless little hip bones that are embedded in their tissue, not even connected to anything else. Again, vestigial structures, because their common ancestor would have had hip bones. And so if you imagine a horse or something like that as another ancestor of, there's a horse, of a whale, it had a common ancestor. One lineage led to whales, one lineage led to horses. This common ancestor would have had hip bones. Whales don't use them anymore, and so they have become vestigial in their use. In humans, we can see some of these wisdom teeth. So if you're lucky enough to have your wisdom teeth removed, you understand that we don't need them. We tend to have them removed. In fact, we often don't have enough room in our jaws to even have them if we wanted them. And they are essentially structures that we no longer use, and they actually become a bit of a problem. Our ancestors would have had more room in their jaw to accommodate more teeth. We have descended from them, so we've inherited that particular trait, but it is no longer one that we particularly use. Same thing with our tailbone. Our ancestors would have had a longer spine and probably a functional tail, but we don't have that trait anymore, and yet we still have this tailbone hanging out the back of our spine, not providing us with any particular benefit. The appendix is another vestigial structure to some degree. Its uses are a little bit not completely useless, but again, our ancestors perhaps had a larger digestive system in which they needed more room to digest plant material, but we still hang on to some of those structures, even though they're not particularly used. Molecular homology is much more convincing than a lot of this anatomical stuff. So the anatomical stuff, you could probably, it's quite conclusive, but again, it can be a little bit blurry as to how well defined certain things are. But what is definitely something that you cannot argue with is the molecular level evidence. And if you look at the actual, going right to the genome, or the products that are produced from that genome, we can see these homologies between species. So all living species use DNA to store information. Doesn't matter what you're talking about. If it's alive, it uses genetic material, and this is a universal genetic code. There's no organism out there using some other method of storing their information. All of them use it through genetic information. It could be RNA in some cases, but it is definitely going to be nucleic acid. Certain biochemical pathways are found in all or nearly all species. So if you look at something like cellular respiration, especially some of the more fundamental parts of it, you're going to see that these biochemical pathways are found in many species, almost exactly the same. They function in the same way. So if we look at this one here, this is a particular gene called P53. It plays a role in preventing cancer. So when a cell is dividing uncontrollably, this gene has a role in terms of preventing that from leading to cancer. Sequences of closely related species tend to be more similar to each other than to distant related species. So here is, in this box here, the sequence for this particular gene, or the products of this particular gene, the P53 protein. And when we look at the species here, so the sequence for the humans, if you take a look at that, these little code words are coding for the amino acids. And if we compare ours to a rhesus monkey, so human versus rhesus monkey, we can see that it's exactly the same written code. The instructions to make this protein are exactly the same, except for there's one change on one of the amino acids. As you move further apart, so that this other green monkey. More distantly related, it also only has one change. But if you go to this rabbit, which we're not as closely related to, there's actually two differences between our code on the top here versus the code of the rabbit itself. So not only can you look at the structures and say, okay, the structures between a rhesus monkey and a human are more similar than a human and a rabbit. It is not just the physical anatomical structures, it is also the molecular level code in which everything is written in. As we move further and further apart, so by the time you get all the way down to a fish, again, it has a lot of similarities. It's still 41% similar, but there is more differences between this gene in a fish versus this gene in a human, compared to this gene in a monkey versus this gene in a human. So homologous genes, these are genes derived from the same ancestral gene. So just like you can imagine an arm being inherited from ancestors and being modified in one way or another, the same thing is going to happen with genes. So this reveals molecular details of the evolutionary change. The two sequences may be similar, but due to the similar ancestral, so you can imagine there's an ancestor with a particular gene, there could be a division, a separation between two branches of lineage, and that gene is then going to be passed on to those two separate branches and continually propagated, but it's going to end up with different changes due to it. So the resulting gene in the descendants will not be identical because each of these lineages, so that one lineage on the left, will accumulate some changes over time. The lineage on the right will accumulate different changes over time as well. And these changes are due to random mutations. Third bit of evidence that really helped Darwin out was fossils. So fossilized ancestors of animals living in the same area. So for example, if you're walking around in South America, you can say, okay, there's a bunch of armadillos around, and you can look at, there's an armadillo, weighs apparently 18 pounds, and they're walking around right now. But if you look in the fossil record of the same location, you can see these giant armadillos. And so if you say, okay, well, a long time ago, there used to be giant armadillos, and now in the same area, there's these modern armadillos, that might make it look like over a period of time, this armadillo species has changed to become the modern armadillo. Looking at horses and their fossils. So the earliest fossils were small with short legs and broad feet. So we're looking at these guys down here and looking at the leg bones of the horse, the early horse. The adaptive changes, so they went from about the size of a dog, and they, again, over time, and here's millions of years here, over time changed to become what we see in terms of the modern day horse. So these attributed to adaptations to changing climate, and so the conditions that lead to the structures you see in the modern day horse are more advantageous for the particular climate that they're in than their ancestors' physiology would have been. All right, if we look at these three skeletons here, we can see this one's a, I can't pronounce this properly, but Compsognathus, so a dinosaur. And then we have another one I can't pronounce, Archaeopteryx. So this is the bird-like dinosaur. And then we see the modern day chicken. So we can see how over time, due to selective pressures within the environment, a species is going to change. And it's not like birds having a completely new system in which they're built. It looks very similar to an older system that used to be around, but it's as if it has slowly changed over time, which goes back to the dinosaur system that would have been around a long time. As the environment changes, the species are also going to change so that they can survive in that new environment, and we end up with our modern day species who do not have a completely unique new system. They just have a modification of what was already there. So Darwin's conclusion, after looking at evidence like this, he was saying that species change over time and they share a common ancestry. Realized that a lot of this evidence was fairly old that Darwin was looking at when he came up with his theory. We looked at some newer evidence as well, such as the molecular evidence to back it up. We've learned a lot since the 1800s, and so the theory of evolution proposed by Darwin is not the same as the theory of evolution as we know it today. We, like any other theory in science, we take what has been proposed and we continually adapt it to accommodate the new evidence, not disregarding it. Instead, what we're doing is we're taking it, we're changing what's wrong and replacing it with what we know to be right based on our current evidence, and therefore developing an even stronger theory than we had before.